America built the most expensive World Cup ticket in the history of sports, then watched its own president say he would not pay for it either. That single sentence tells you almost everything you need to know about the political circus wrapped around the 2026 World Cup, a tournament that was supposed to be a triumphant showcase of American infrastructure and now looks, week after week, like a slow-motion audit of broken promises. The knockout rounds kicked off this past weekend, and the football itself has been thrilling. Morocco stunned Canada, France ground past Paraguay, and fans across 11 host cities are watching some of the best soccer the world has ever produced on American soil. But underneath the highlight reels sits a second tournament, one that has almost nothing to do with goals and everything to do with visas, train fares, hotel spreadsheets, and a president who cannot stop commenting on ticket prices for a sport he has never pretended to love. Start with the trains, because the trains are where the politics of this World Cup became impossible to ignore. New Jersey Transit was handed one job: move roughly 40,000 fans per match from Penn Station in New York to MetLife Stadium in New Jersey, home of the final on the 19th of July. That trip, a round journey of about 18 miles, normally costs a little under $13. For the World Cup, the agency initially priced a round-trip ticket at $150, more than 11 times the standard fare. When the number became public, it made international headlines within days, and New Jersey's governor found herself negotiating in public with corporate sponsors just to make the optics survivable. DoorDash, Audible, and the sports betting company FanDuel eventually chipped in enough sponsorship money to knock the price down to $98. Sit with that for a second. A public commuter rail line funded by taxpayers needed a food delivery app, an audiobook subscription service, and a gambling company to subsidize a train ticket down to a merely outrageous price instead of an absurd one. The consequences did not stop at the ticket booth. Penn Station shut its doors to regular commuters for 4 hours before every match at MetLife. Employers near the stadium corridor asked staff to work from home on match days, effectively rearranging the daily lives of thousands of New Jersey residents around a soccer tournament they may never even attend. And despite all of that disruption, the trains have not been full. After Brazil played Morocco in one of the marquee group stage fixtures at MetLife, local news outlets reported cars that were visibly under capacity, suggesting that plenty of local fans simply chose to drive instead. Driving, as it turns out, was not the bargain option either, since FIFA banned fan parking at the stadium's own lots and left nearby parking to private operators charging up to $225 a spot. People were willing to pay more than double the train fare just to sit in New Jersey traffic, rather than deal with the rail system built specifically for them. Now for the political fallout, because this is where the story stops being about transit and starts being about accountability. New Jersey Transit's own leadership has publicly admitted that its planning assumptions came directly from FIFA and from the private company that manages parking around the stadium complex, and that those numbers were simply wrong. The agency has now disclosed that running World Cup shuttle service across just 8 match days in June and July will cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $62 million, a bill that lands directly on an agency already staring down a budget shortfall for the coming fiscal year. Layer on top of that a fare hike that took effect at the start of July, a 3% system-wide increase that marks the 3rd consecutive year of fare hikes for New Jersey commuters, and you can see why transit funding has quietly become one of the sharpest political flashpoints heading into this year's midterm elections. Riders who never bought a single World Cup ticket are now paying more for their daily commute, partly because a global sporting body handed a state agency numbers that never matched reality. The hotel story follows a similar arc, though it has taken an interesting turn as the tournament has progressed. Back in the spring, the American Hotel and Lodging Association surveyed more than 200 properties across the 11 host cities and found that roughly 80% were tracking below their own forecasts. A startling number for what was billed as the biggest sporting event in American history. Kansas City was the worst performer by a wide margin, with 85 to 90% of hotels reporting bookings below what a normal, event-free summer would typically generate. It later emerged that FIFA itself had canceled about 3/4 of its reserved hotel room blocks in the Kansas City metro area back in February, quietly releasing that inventory onto the open market and making the shortfall look even more dramatic than it actually was. Here is the twist that the earlier chapters of this story could not have predicted. As the tournament reached the knockout stage, Kansas City's hotel numbers actually started to turn around. With Argentina playing there in the round of 32, bookings in the days surrounding that match jumped by more than 100% compared to the same period a year earlier. According to figures from the city's tourism bureau, it is not the sweeping national economic boom that FIFA promised, but it is a real measurable recovery for a city that spent months as the tournament's most visible cautionary tale. The lesson buried in that reversal is almost more interesting than the original shortfall. Marquee teams and marquee matchups can still rescue a host city's numbers, but only in the final stretch, and only for the cities lucky enough to draw a blockbuster fixture. Everywhere else, the gap between projection and reality has simply become the accepted cost of doing business with FIFA. Nationally, the picture remains rougher than organizers hoped. Industry surveys conducted as the group stage wrapped up found that a majority of surveyed hoteliers pointed to visa delays and geopolitical tensions, not simple lack of interest, as the primary reason international travelers stayed away. Overall inbound tourism to the United States had already fallen more than 5% in the prior year, and the tournament was explicitly supposed to reverse that slide. Instead, economists who study the financial impact of mega events, including researchers at the College of the Holy Cross, have pointed out that early projections for tournaments like this one are almost always wildly optimistic, and that expanding the field to 48 teams only made things worse by producing far more lower-profile matchups with limited fan interest and limited travel demand. The Council on Foreign Relations has estimated that the tournament's real economic impact will land at roughly 1/3 of FIFA's original $40 billion projection, a gap large enough to reshape how future host countries think about bidding for the event at all. If the trains and the hotels represent the economic side of this story, the treatment of players and officials at the American border represents its most politically explosive chapter. An Iraqi striker was detained for nearly 7 hours at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. His phone inspected while immigration officers ran through their standard battery of questions. The team's own photographer was held for hours and ultimately denied entry altogether, unable to document his country's first World Cup appearance in decades. When reporters asked Customs and Border Protection to explain the detentions, a spokesperson offered the kind of answer that satisfies no one, saying only that admissibility decisions are made on a case-by-case basis. A Somali match official scheduled to referee at the tournament was denied entry entirely and never made it onto the pitch, meaning FIFA's own credentialing process was overridden by the immigration policy of the country FIFA chose as co-host. Nothing captured the tension of this tournament quite like Iran's experience, though the story has an important postscript that changes how it should be understood today. Iran's national team was originally supposed to base itself in Arizona, but visa complications involving senior football federation officials forced a dramatic pivot, and the squad ended up headquartered across the border in Tijuana, Mexico, commuting into the United States only on match days for its 3 group stage games in Los Angeles and Seattle. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum personally confirmed the arrangement, and it marked the first time in World Cup history that a host nation effectively refused to lodge a competing country's team on its own soil for the duration of the tournament. Players wore small pins bearing the number 168, a tribute to the victims of a school attack back home, and their hotel was wrapped in heavy security throughout their stay. The diplomatic temperature around Iran's participation was still rising in early June when the country's captain stood in front of reporters after Iran's final group stage match and called the entire experience a disaster, criticizing FIFA for failing to resolve serious off-pitch problems ranging from constant long-distance travel between distant host cities to hostile treatment at the border. He specifically pointed to a ban on displaying the country's traditional lion and sun emblem inside the stadium during Iran's tournament opener against New Zealand, a symbolic flashpoint that reflected the broader political sensitivity surrounding Iran's presence at an American-hosted event. What makes this story worth revisiting now, though, is the shift that followed. Just about a week after a peace agreement was signed easing hostilities involving Iran, the Department of Homeland Security relaxed some of the travel restrictions on the Iranian delegation, allowing players to enter the country slightly earlier than the strict same-day arrival and departure rule that had governed their first matches. It is a small adjustment in the grand scheme of things, but it shows how directly this tournament has been shaped by live diplomatic and military developments happening thousands of miles away from any football pitch. None of this unfolded in a political vacuum, and the man at the center of American politics has never been shy about inserting himself into the conversation. President Trump has repeatedly called this the most successful World Cup in history, pointing to FIFA's claim of roughly 5 million tickets sold as proof of unprecedented demand. Yet in the same breath, when asked directly about the price of a ticket to watch his own country's opening match against Paraguay, tickets that started above $1,000 in the cheapest category, Trump admitted he was not aware of the number and said plainly that he would not pay it either. That comment landed just days after FIFA President Gianni Infantino, a longtime ally of the president, publicly defended the tournament's dynamic pricing model at a major economic conference in Beverly Hills, creating one of the more visible public disagreements between the two men since Trump returned to office. The pricing story only escalated from there. By April, the maximum price for a final ticket had climbed to nearly $11,000, almost 7 times higher than the $1,550 ceiling that organizers had promised during the original North American bid process, back when the United States, Canada, and Mexico were competing to host the tournament. Resale listings push things even further into absurdity, with some seats for the final appearing on FIFA's own official resale marketplace at prices approaching $2 million each. A single front row seat for an earlier match in Houston reportedly sold for $32,000. Average ticket prices for the final now sit somewhere around $13,000, compared with roughly $1,600 for the equivalent seat at the last World Cup in Qatar. For a president who has built much of his political identity around speaking for working-class Americans, openly conceding that even he finds the tournament's pricing indefensible was a notable moment, one that handed critics of the tournament a rare bipartisan talking point. It is worth pausing here to consider what all of this says about the deeper relationship between sports, politics, and national image in 2026 America. FIFA sold host cities and the federal government on the idea of a tournament that would generate an enormous economic windfall, ease strained diplomatic relationships through the unifying power of sport, and cement the United States as the undisputed capital of global soccer for a generation. Instead, the tournament has become a live case study in what happens when optimistic projections collide with immigration enforcement, transit budgets, and hotel occupancy spreadsheets that refuse to cooperate. Every one of the storylines running through this tournament, the pricing backlash, the border detentions, the underperforming hotels, and the overwhelmed transit agencies, traces back to the same root cause, a persistent gap between what organizers promised and what the country's existing infrastructure and immigration systems were actually built to deliver. Looking ahead to the remainder of the knockout stage, there are a few threads worth watching closely. Attendance and hotel bookings will likely see a modest bump for the marquee matchups still to come, particularly any fixtures involving Argentina, Brazil, France, or England, teams that travel with enormous, well-resourced fan bases capable of filling rooms on short notice. That bump, however, is unlikely to close the structural gap between FIFA's original projections and the tournament's actual economic performance. New Jersey's transit costs are almost certain to become a genuine campaign issue heading into this year's midterm elections, especially in districts where commuters have absorbed both a fare hike and a World Cup surcharge in the same calendar year. Multiple state attorneys general are reportedly examining ticketing and resale practices tied to the tournament, and the first formal findings from at least one of those inquiries could land before the final whistle blows on the 19th of July. That final, set to be played at MetLife Stadium in front of a global television audience larger than any sporting event has ever drawn, will take place in a venue where the train costs $98, parking costs $225, and the cheapest available ticket approaches 5 figures. The irony writing itself here is almost too clean. A tournament built, at least in its marketing, around bringing the world's game to everyday American fans will end its run, watched by more people at home than in any World Cup final in history, largely because attending in person has been priced and logistically engineered out of reach for the very fans it claimed to be built for. FIFA constructed an enormous, glittering party, then quietly locked the front door behind a wall of transit surcharges, hotel algorithms, and border checkpoints, and now finds itself puzzled that so many of the neighbors never showed up. There is also a broader political undercurrent to this tournament that deserves its own attention, because Gianni Infantino's relationship with the Trump administration has become one of the more unusual alliances in modern sports governance. Infantino has appeared alongside Trump at multiple White House events since the president's return to office, and the FIFA president has publicly praised the administration's handling of tournament logistics, even as his own organization absorbs criticism for pricing, scheduling, and hotel allocation decisions. Critics of that closeness argue that FIFA has effectively outsourced its public relations problems to a friendly White House while quietly shifting blame for infrastructure failures onto local transit agencies and municipal governments that had little say in FIFA's original demand projections. Supporters of the arrangement counter that a cooperative federal government has actually smoothed over what could have been far worse visa and security bottlenecks, pointing to the eventual resolution of Iran's travel restrictions as evidence that diplomatic flexibility, however reluctant, can still solve real problems when the political will exists. The immigration enforcement question, meanwhile, has taken on a life of its own, well beyond the individual detentions of the Iraqi striker and the Somali referee. Civil liberties groups and several international football federations have raised concerns that Customs and Border Protection's case-by-case screening approach, while technically neutral on paper, has disproportionately affected travelers from countries with existing tension or diplomatic friction with Washington. FIFA has so far declined to publicly criticize its host nation's border policies in any detailed way, limiting its public statements to general expressions of confidence that logistical issues will be resolved before the tournament concludes. That silence has itself become a talking point, with several sports commentators noting that an organization willing to sanction entire national federations for uniform violations or crowd behavior has been notably quiet about detentions involving its own credentialed athletes and officials. On the pure football side of things, the knockout stage has at least given fans plenty to talk about beyond the politics. Morocco's win over Canada in the round of 32 continued a surprising run for African sides at this tournament, while France's comfortable victory over Paraguay reinforced their status as one of the favorites heading into the quarterfinals. Argentina, the defending champion, has continued to draw some of the largest and most enthusiastic traveling crowds of the tournament, which helps explain why cities lucky enough to host their matches, including Kansas City, have seen such a dramatic short-term boost in hotel demand. England's continued progress has kept British broadcasters and fans deeply invested despite the logistical complaints, and matches in Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Arlington are shaping up to be among the most closely watched fixtures of the entire competition as the bracket narrows toward the semifinals in mid-July. Whatever happens on the pitch over the next 2 weeks, the political and economic scorecard for this World Cup already looks remarkably different from the one FIFA drew up when it awarded the tournament to the United States, Mexico, and Canada years ago. A joint hosting bid built around shared infrastructure and shared economic upside has, in practice, produced a patchwork of city-by-city winners and losers, a transit agency staring down a budget crisis, a hotel industry that only found relief once marquee teams finally arrived, and a diplomatic subplot involving Iran that shifted in real time alongside geopolitical events happening far outside any stadium. The final on the 19th of July will settle the championship. It will not settle the argument over whether this tournament actually delivered what it promised the country that spent years and billions of dollars preparing to host it.